Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. Violent protests have rocked Kazakhstan. President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has reacted by ordering security forces to open fire without warning on people he refers to as terrorists. Moscow has sent in troops as peacekeepers to quell the uprising. The Central Asian country, once known for its political stability, is now facing its worst unrest since independence from Russia 30 years ago. Protests began on January the 2nd after a sharp increase in fuel prices in the oil-rich nation, but they have since grown into larger anti-government riots. To try to calm tensions, Tokayev sacked the government, declared a 2-week state of emergency, and shut down the internet. He also called on the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a Russia-led military alliance, to restore stability on the streets of Kazakhstan. And to discuss the current crisis, I'm joined now from Brussels by Theresa Fallon. She is the director of the Center for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies. And in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, we have Jennifer Murtazashvili, the director at the Center for Governance and Markets and associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Ladies, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So protests over hiked up fuel prices over the last weekend have now grown into larger anti-government riots, and President Tokayev ordered security forces to open fire on what he refers to as terrorists without warning. Jennifer, what is this crisis headed? Where is this headed? And how dire is the situation in Kazakhstan?
Well, this is a very serious situation because President Tokayev has really escalated the situation by his desire and to use coercive force. This means that there really is no opportunity for negotiations between the protesters and the government. And I think there was hope a couple of days ago that there would be some sort of space for this. It appears that that is not going to be the case, that the government is going to respond with decisive repression. And in a country like Kazakhstan that has enjoyed some political and economic freedoms, I think this will be a very bitter pill to swallow.
So, Theresa, hiked up fuel prices might have been the spark of these protests, but what else has fueled this anger?
A lot of speculation about this. There's even some discussion of infighting between supporters of Nursultan Nazarbayev and the current government. So that's all speculation. It's a black box. But we also see a great deal of concern because of Russia and China. China has a great deal of investments, and they're both Russia and China have irredentist claims. So there's some speculation that Moscow might ask for a bit of northern Kazakhstan as a payoff for helping to quell the protests.
Okay, so Theresa, President Tokayev has appealed to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, decrying the actions of terrorists and alleging that the country had been the victim of attacks by foreign-trained gangs after fuel prices rises. And Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan has also confirmed that and blamed the outside interference for mass protests. Who are those people?
This is a classic Soviet playbook. To call in the CSTO, they had to show that it was an outside influence. So not that the domestic population was rioting and were disgruntled. So I think that this is a classic. The Armenian leader is ahead of the CSTO right now, but most people see it as a Russian move. And perhaps even Putin asked to come in. So we're not really clear on that. That's also another black box.
So, Jennifer, bearing in mind that the Russians make up the 20% of the 19 million population of Kazakhstan, I mean, isn't it the government's responsibility to detect the terrorists beforehand? And what's your take on this? I mean, Pashinyan blaming the outside interference for mass protests. Who are those outsiders?
This is absurd. The protests began over gas prices. And if we look at what's been going on inside of Kazakhstan for the past several years, these protests did not come out of nowhere. We have seen these kinds of very localized protests about the kinds of issues that the protesters were discussing for years now, especially since President Tokayev took power in 2019. So these protests have been endemic, and they have focused on very localized concerns, economic grievances. And in fact, President Tokayev himself has said the country needs significant political and economic reforms to respond to the issues that the protesters have been raising. Now, that was before this week, and he has actually laid out significant reform programs that he has never implemented. So if he could just do that, I think one of the demands that the protesters were making is that he go ahead and move forward with some of the reforms on local democracy, on enhancing greater local participation and decision making, on economic issues. It seemed like there was a real opportunity for him to negotiate. So I think something else is going on here that we don't quite understand, as Theresa said, why he called in the Russians, why he was so quick to point out that these were terrorists.
So, Theresa, how would Moscow-led CSTO's presence in the country impact the global oil and gas markets? I mean, what kind of, for example, implications it would have on China's oil and gas purchase from Central Asia? And how do you think they'll stay for?
If I was Beijing, I would be quite concerned right now because in the past, we saw the reason that Khodorkovsky ended up in the Gulag was that he was trying to create an independent pipeline from Kazakhstan to sell energy to China. And this was, a red line for Putin. So he sees an opportunity now to get in there. And this would really be putting a foot on China's neck. We know that China and Russia have this kind of axis of convenience, or a marriage of convenience, I should say. But there are areas that Putin can just wait and seize an opportunity and grasps it. Because if he can control Kazakhstan oil exports to China on one end of China's Belt and Road Initiative, he can also stop Chinese trains coming into Europe from Belarus. So he's just been waiting and playing a bad hand very well, actually. And I think Beijing should be quite concerned about these moves.
So what's your take on that, Jennifer? Would you agree with Theresa? And would this give Russia more leverage on energy issues and strengthen its influence over the broader region?
Absolutely. I agree with the issue of gas and how this gives Russia a great deal more leverage in terms of that issue. But I would also just point out that I'm not entirely sure that this is a crisis Russia wants right now. Russia has been very occupied with the issue of Ukraine. I think this issue came out of nowhere for Russia. Russia is actually sending a very small number of troops to Kazakhstan, but it certainly does give Russia enormous leverage over what's going on inside of Kazakhstan at a very convenient time for them. As Kazakhstan over the past several years has maintained this multi-vectored foreign policy, looking many different directions, it looks very clearly that Kazakhstan now has its face pointed directly towards Russia.
So, Theresa, China seems opposed to the deployment of CSTO forces. Its foreign ministry spokesman said China and Kazakhstan are friendly neighbors and permanent comprehensive strategic partners. What happened in Kazakhstan is its domestic affairs. It is believed its government can properly handle with it. What do you make of this Chinese reaction now that the government forces are allowed to shoot protesters without warning?
Well, first of all, I think it sent a real sign to Beijing that Kazakhstan didn't turn to the SCO. They turned to Russia through the CSTO. So that's a sign that China's footprint in the region will probably be somewhat in decline. And I think that Kazakhstan also has issues with with China in regard to Kazakh citizens being put into these camps in Xinjiang. So there's also other issues that are kind of bubbling underneath the surface there. And Kazakhstan has been rather quiet about the seizure of Kazakh citizens and who are put into Xinjiang. I think that China does not like any sort of actions of outside powers coming in to suppress any form of this is part of their playbook, but I think that they understand that this is a huge play that Russia can play in Central Asia. There has been sort of a condominium between Russia and China on how power is being shared out. Obviously, China is a much stronger rising power with deeper pockets, but things are starting to unravel for them. And I think Putin really made a clever move. I agree that this might not be the best time because they have the meetings in Geneva, but I think Putin is playing this hand extremely well.
So, Jennifer, how would a destabilized Kazakhstan impact the region? Why its stability is crucial for the broader region? Talk to us about its geopolitical importance, especially after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
So Kazakhstan has always been seen as an island of stability, the most stable country in the region. It hasn't seen large amounts of unrest. And I think what this signifies to other countries is that especially to neighboring countries like Uzbekistan, who are going to be looking at these events very carefully and with actually great concern. Neighboring Uzbekistan is one of the only countries in the region that is not members of the CSTO,
Yes.
and has really tried to push back against a lot of Russian intervention in its both domestic economy and its foreign policy. And there's going to be enormous pressure on Uzbekistan going forward. But in terms of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's very interesting to hear China say this, because China has recently, established military presence in Tajikistan. It seems absolutely fine to have Russian military presence in Tajikistan guarding the Afghan border. It has had no problem with Russian CSTO forces in Kyrgyzstan. So China here is now saying that this is a domestic
Yes.
dispute, and it is not terrorism, and that is really key, because China is always is quick to talk about terrorism.
Yes.
So this is definitely a fissure that we see emerging.
So Theresa, has the calling on CSTO hurt the country's perceived strength as a regional leader, and is it a blow against the country's sovereignty?
Well, this is a very difficult situation for the current government, because if things continue to escalate, they will be seen, and since it is a domestic issue, not foreign interference, the Russian soldiers, if they have a very light footprint there, but it could be perceived as the Russians kind of pushing down. So they have a very difficult tightrope act to follow here. They don't want, as we've seen in Belarus as well. So the Russians had to be very cautious not to be seen as an outside oppressor, but as, they'll have to use very careful propaganda to try to win hearts and minds. But I think this is a difficult problem for the Russians to play it very, very carefully, as well as helping the current government if they want, and they'll have some sort of trade-off, and there will be it shows that Russia, at the end of the day, is still the favored partner. And the demands coming out of Moscow now is to return. I don't know if this is something that Kazakhstan will actually do, but that they should return to Cyrillic and not the Latin alphabet. So Kazakhstan's, it's an odd situation that they're going to be in, under what will be extracted from the current government in exchange for keeping them in power.
So, Jennifer, how will this crisis change Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy that allowed it to balance the interests of its big neighbors like Russia, China, as well as the US and Europe?
So, it looks like that Kazakhstan, by taking this move, by allowing Russian forces in, the CSTO forces, is positioning itself towards Russia. And so if we understand what Belarus, what other countries that are very close to the Russian orbit have done, it's rejecting a lot of, EU, US engagement. I think it's definitely a move away from China. And I think that it is a very significant threat to the country's own sovereignty. Because recall, for 30 years, Kazakhstan just marked 30 years of independence. The countries of Central Asia have been so proud of the sovereignty that they gained during this period of time. And yes, the CSTO has a very limited mandate. We should be very clear that their mandate is very limited inside. It's a peacekeeping mandate. So technically, it is not a sovereignty threat, but symbolically, this is a huge blow to the sovereignty that people of Kazakhstan have sought to build over the past 30 years.
So, Theresa, how is the Western Front reacting to this crisis, and does the international community fear a reprise of 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea?
Well, I think that we've seen from history that once Russian troops are invited in, it's very difficult to get them to leave. So I think that this is a big concern. Also, there are three claims of irredentist claims that Russia has. One is Ukraine, one is Moldova, and the other is Kazakhstan. So we see that Georgia and Kazakhstan, Georgia, and Ukraine. So they've made their moves, and this is the last one on Putin's list. So his kind of Soviet nostalgia has actually got a fist bump at this point. So we'll see what happens. But the economic issues, China was seen as a big economic propeller with the Belt and Road Initiative, although that has declined since 2016, their investments. But Kazakhstan, the size of Kazakhstan is the size of Western Europe. That was a key player for China's strategy for the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think that this may be a huge setback for Beijing's strategy.
Yes, we're talking about the geopolitical implications of this crisis, but people's lives are, of course, at stake. So, Jennifer, very quickly, what comes next? And are we likely to see more violence, or is the Nazarbayev era over now?
Well, the Nazarbayev era is over. I don't know what this means, though, for violence. And in fact, we haven't heard from Nazarbayev at all. So it's actually not clear at all where he is. And that's actually something that we should all look out for. But in terms of the violence, these protests were so widespread. And either people are going to respond to the use of force that the government is threatening and stand back. I think that's actually highly unlikely. I think we're going to see protests continue. And the question is, what is the president going to make good on his threat to shoot anybody?
Yes.
And if he does, that is going to change the political, the economic landscape. Kazakhstan was seen as a friendly place to invest because there was the rule of law. There was some predictability. And this is going to really, and that's
Yes.
going to hurt the people of Kazakhstan economically as well. So this is not looking good for the people of Kazakhstan.
All right, ladies, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.